So since we're currently on the road to 1,000 members of the community, once we hit it, I'll be doing a 1,000 subscriber special where I'll be doing a Q&A style video. So if you guys have any questions you want to ask me, leave them down below and I'll choose a couple to answer and talk about. And now, on to the video. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Kingdom Hearts theory video. So I've been seeing some discourse about a certain theory about the Master of Masters that I'd like to talk about and discuss with you guys. So when it comes to theories about Kingdom Hearts, I've made a lot of them, I've seen a lot of them online and in other videos, but there's one theory that's been fairly consistent, and that is Sora being the Master of Masters. And I get why it'd be a popular theory, because Luxio being Xigbar really opened the floodgates of everyone in the series possibly not being who we thought they were. Not to say that it didn't exist before, but I think there's been a lot more since the reveal in the epilogue of KH3. It's been really interesting to see how one reveal could spark a ton of new theories, and it really shows how creative this community can be. But when it comes to the actual theory of Sora being the Master of Masters, the theory itself gained a lot of credibility with the most recent Unicross update, because it was initially thought that you needed a version of yourself waiting at the destination, and by that it was understood that it meant a full person, but with the Master of Masters, he only needed his eye, which was enough to give him a waypoint into the future. So theoretically, there is a way Sora could be the Master of Masters. But honestly, while it's possible, I kind of don't want that theory to be true, because even if the Master of Masters does end up being Sora from a different world line or something along the lines of that, there is a better theory that I actually hope does end up happening, and that is the theory of the Master of Masters actually being named Light, or being a being of pure light. And if you haven't heard of this theory yet, the basic premise is that when the Master of Masters is talking with young Xehanort in Remind, he talks about truth being what you see with your eyes and not what you hear. He then proceeds to tell Xehanort his name, but before he says it, there is this flash of light, and that's it. So a lot of people are saying that the Master of Masters' name is actually Light, or that he's a being of pure light, which at the time was about as credible as any other theory around, but then we got introduced to the entity known as Darkness in Unicross, which gave the theory a lot more credibility, because if beings of pure darkness exist, there's no reason beings of pure light couldn't exist either. And then it was confirmed in the most recent Unicross update that beings of pure light do exist. Now, what I like about this theory isn't whether or not it's true. You know, it'd be great if it is, but if it ain't, I ain't really losing any sleep over it. But what makes me like it is the fact that if it is true, it could tie in really well with where the series could go in terms of messing with the classic concept of light and darkness. Because over the course of the series, Kingdom Hearts has played with light and darkness so much, and I'm glad they're not just going with the classic light is good and darkness is evil. And not to say those themes are bad, those themes can be good if they're done well, but I like that Kingdom Hearts adds layers of complexity within them. Like, I've talked about them so much on this channel before, but we see this with Master Xehanort not actually being evil even though he's on the side of darkness, and Master Ericus not being a full-blown saint even though he's on the side of light. Even Riku, who is on the side of darkness, does end up achieving a balance and uses both when he fights. They've shown that it's not really as black and white as people make it out to be. There's a lot of gray area in between, and we literally see this with the concept of nobodies who exist between light and darkness. This series has talked about more of a balance more than anything, and I think with beings called darkness now a part of the series, this could be an interesting route to explore if the Master of Masters ends up being a creature of pure light. And even if there are more creatures of darkness than there are of light, the Foretellers could actually end up playing a much bigger role in this, because they are the sort of champions of light as we see in back cover. If the Master of Masters does end up becoming a person of pure light, that means that they could end up literally receiving the teachings of light, which could be why they end up clashing with the Guardians of Light. Because we all know that both are on the side of light, but remember, almost all of the Guardians of Light have been exposed to the darkness in some capacity. Terra and Aqua ended up falling to darkness, and Ven harbored the being known as darkness inside of him for a pretty long time. Axel used darkness in the organization. Roxas and Xion were associated with people who used the darkness on a regular basis. Even Sora ended up turning himself into a Heartless and has multiple dark forms, and Riku still uses the darkness when he fights to this day. And even this might be a stretch, but even Mickey ended up going to the realm of darkness to find the Kingdom Key D, which he used until Kingdom Hearts 3. The only characters in the Guardians of Light who haven't messed with the darkness in some capacity are Kairi, since she's a Princess of Heart, Donald, and Goofy. And since the Foretellers seem to be so against the side of darkness, they could end up seeing the Guardians of Light as people who have been tainted by the darkness, and end up fighting against them as beings who literally received the teachings of light in the form of the Master of Masters. And that in itself could be a good way to build upon themes we've already experienced in the series and possibly do it better than we've ever seen it done before. Because with Xehanort being presented as a villain, even though we know he seeks balance, the methods he resorted to painted him as a villain, which don't necessarily feel wrong when the Guardians of Light go up against him. But if the Master of Masters ends up being a being of pure light and the foretellers receiving the teaching of that light, it would create an interesting contrast between beings who are pure light or close to it and the Guardians of Light, who could be seen as a sort of impure light or a false light in the eyes of the foretellers and the Master of Masters. The conflict of light against light would be a great way to show just exactly how complex those themes could be when they're actually put into practice. I've made this theory on the channel before about how the foretellers could not actually be evil, and I think if the Master of Masters ends up being light, that could still technically be true. But instead of these sort of misguided protagonists on the side of darkness, they'd just be misguided protagonists on the side of light. It'd be interesting to see how the foretellers come to realize that darkness doesn't mean evil, it just depends on what you do with it as they clash with the Guardians of Light. I think if we do end up fighting alongside the foretellers at some point, that would be a good way to show their character progression. Having them essentially grow to learn from the Guardians of Light would be a great way to build upon the concept of light and darkness that's been present in the series for so long. In some ways, the foretellers would end up getting the character progression that Master Eraqus never really got to have because of what happened in Birth by Sleep. But at the end of the day, I do think this would be a much more interesting route to go than the Master of Masters just being Sora. Because if the Master of Masters were just to become another version of Sora, it would take away from the mystery of the Master of Masters. If you were to just be Sora, the focus would shift from who's the Master of Masters and why is he like this, what is his motivation, to how did Sora become this way. And I think while the Master of Masters being Sora wouldn't be the worst thing, I think this would definitely be a better way to go, because it opens the door to some great character moments and some interesting character development that we could see during Phase 2. But what do you guys think? Would you guys want the Master of Masters to be Sora, or would you want him to be Light, or would you rather him be someone else? Like Demyx. Either way, let me know down below in the comments. And if you like what you saw here, make sure you go subscribe so you can see more of it. But that's gonna be all from me today, so this is Moose Wayne, signing off.